Welcome to Crime Survivors Speak. My name is Aswad Thomas. I'm the National Director of Crime Survivors for Safety and Justice. We are a national network of 200,000 victims of crime across the country. And if you haven't already subscribed to stay up to date on the latest episodes, you can do that on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and other streaming services by clicking the link on your screen or going to the website at www.cssj.org. Today, I have another amazing guest with me. We're joined by Anthony DiMartino. Anthony is the Director of Government Affairs at Californians for Safety and Justice, where he leads legislative and budget advocacy efforts in the California capital and also across the state and local communities. Anthony comes from a background in social work and also social welfare. Anthony is extremely experienced and deeply knowledgeable advocate for passing criminal justice reform, but also passing a lot of survivor-centered policies. So for anyone interested in learning the real behind-the-scene work of passing legislation and policy change, this episode is going to be full of important information, motivation to help you get started in that advocacy journey. Anthony, thank you so much for joining today's conversation.
Thank you so much, Aswad, and thank you for that beautiful introduction. I really do appreciate that, and I'm humbled to be here.
Awesome. So let's get right into it. So Anthony, can you share some of the experiences that led you to join Californians for Safety and Justice and become deeply involved in reforming the criminal justice system?
Yeah, when I was thinking about this question, the first thing that came to mind, and it's probably the most transformative experience that I had, was in undergrad and college at the University of Redlands. I participated as a volunteer in a program that went into the local juvenile hall, and it was my first time ever going into a locked facility setting. Prior to that, I had worked with youth out in community, but I had never gone into a locked facility. And the very first time I ever went in, I was just so emotionally disturbed and traumatized by seeing young folks that looked like me, right? Mostly black and brown kids, boys, locked in cells, cages, and it broke my heart. And that first time I went in, I had an interaction with a young man that really drove home the point of experiences and systems and how I very easily could have been a kid caught up in that experience and how my life may look different. And so after leaving the hall that day, I vowed to do everything in my power to change societal conditions so that we didn't have any need for cages for kids and adults. And that led me to pursue my master's in social welfare after undergrad. And I've always had just, I think, a deep compassion and empathy for folks. And I was really drawn to criminal justice work and then Californians for Safety and Justice because I always say that all the failures in society that we have, whether it's we don't provide affordable housing, we don't have good paying jobs, we don't have access to healthcare or good education, all of those failures, we always end up criminalizing folks on the back end, and we have a bloated criminal justice system. So as someone that cares about social justice across the board, working on criminal justice reform issues, criminal legal issues, provides me an opportunity to connect all those dots and really make the case for better investments in all of those other areas as well. And Californians for Safety and Justice, to me, was an org I met right away when I started as a staffer at the California State Assembly, and I loved that they organize crime survivors and people living with old convictions, and that they recognize there's a ton of overlap in those two worlds, and that they brought both groups together to advocate for safety and justice.
Thank you, Anthony. You and I have had many conversations over the years, and just hearing you talk about that experience of working in a local facility really brought me back to when I was pursuing my master's degree, and my first internship was at the Connecticut Juvenile Training School. And just like you, I had that same experience of seeing young black and brown boys, right, in those units, and just feeling really heartbroken after leaving that day. And I remember, just like you, I kind of left that facility and said, man, I want to make this change, which really led me to doing the work that I'm doing today, which is similar to the work that you have been doing, the work that Californians for Safety and Justice is doing. So thank you so much for sharing that and kind of what led you to doing this work. Anthony, as someone who's deeply involved in not only criminal justice, but deeply involved in advocating for survivor-centered policies, can you share some examples of how you've been able to effectively use the personal stories of survivors to drive meaningful policy change with legislators?
Yeah, for sure. And thanks, Aswad, for sharing your story. Really just speaks to, like I said, the connections we all have. I think the story that really comes to mind for me in regards to making sure survivors are centered and their stories are uplifted. We've had this bill that we've been working on for quite a while now, actually back to the summer of 2020, George Floyd. We introduced a bill with some of our partners to try to make sure that individuals that have been harmed or families that have lost loved ones to police use of force are eligible to apply for victims' compensation here in the state of California. For the most part, they are not eligible for some technical reasons and some reasons around police reporting. So it's been a big fight for us for several years. The first year we introduced that bill, it didn't make it because of the price unfortunately attached to it. And then the next year we brought it back and we had some really great success, and we were getting close to the finish line with the bill, and we weren't certain if we got the bill to the governor, if the governor would sign it. And so we were getting close to the deadline to get the bill to the governor, and scheduled a call with the governor's top legislative person, deputy, and another person in their office, and had a few of our survivors on the Zoom that have been affected by police violence. And one woman shared her story of losing her partner to police use of force. And the whole Zoom was just emotional. You could just feel the compassion and the care for this individual. And after that call, it was pretty certain that if we got the bill to the governor would sign it, and that the story did a whole lot to really drive home the need for the bill. Unfortunately, we didn't get the bill off the last floor vote. We're still working on it to this day. But the power of that story, the power of that experience, the emotion behind it, the trauma moved some of the key folks in the governor's office to feel strongly about supporting the bill. And that bill, we've had many powerful conversations with members and staffers where they've heard from loved ones that have been affected by this issue.
Thank you for sharing that. And for many people out there that are listening, many of the legislators who you've talked to in law enforcement don't see people, especially victims and families impacted by the use of force by police, are often aren't seen as crime victims, right? But go through that same process of grieving, that same process of depression and hurt and anger and that isolation, go through the same traumatic experiences. So that's groundbreaking legislation that you all are working on in California, right? To ensure that people harmed, families who lose loved ones to police violence also get access to compensation. It's huge. So thank you for sharing that story, but also for your leadership these past few years. Can you provide insights into how advocates can establish and nurture relationships with legislators to gain support for survivor-centered policies, even if those legislators are folks you may disagree with on many other issues?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think not even just relevant to policy work, but I like to think about relationships change the world day to day, your relationship with yourself, relationship with others. So I take it very seriously in the work that I do and how CSSJ shows up in the Capitol when we're interacting with the scheduler or the intern or the chief of staff or the legislator themselves. I think three things come to mind for me. Always thinking about like shared values. I think that's another big reason why CSJ was an organization I was excited to join when I left my previous job. Thinking about the shared values really of safety, right? I think everyone can relate to and wants safety for their communities. And starting from that place with an individual, a legislator, a staffer, even if they may not be completely supportive of all of our policies or be on the opposite side, it's hard to argue with the notion that we all want and deserve safety. So finding those different shared values that you may have with the individual you're trying to talk to, whatever the issue is, starting from that place and trying to build from there is something I highly recommend. Second, I think trying to do more listening than talking. If they're a good legislator, I think they're doing a lot of listening, but they also like to talk. They're an elected official because they want to represent their community, and representing their community usually means they have to speak up. And so getting them to talk and feel like they're really being heard by you and that you can reflect back to them what you're hearing is a really tremendous opportunity, right? And making sure that folks feel heard, whether you agree or you don't, just feeling heard makes you feel appreciated, and people will remember how you made them feel. And lastly, I think nurturing relationship means being consistent and being true to your word and to yourself. So in this work, I've really had to learn to say, I don't know when I don't, and also to learn, like, I'll get back to you, being consistent with that and not over promising, but over delivering when I can. And always saying, like, if I don't know something, I don't know, but I'll get back to you. And so making sure I just show up for those folks when I say I'm going to shows that we can be dependable and counted on, and that our survivors are going to show up and show out and support.
We all want to be safe, so establishing shared values are important. Anthony, you also mentioned do more listening than talking, right? So as you're listening and active listening, being able to repeat back what you heard so that they feel that they're being listened to and heard as well. And I think most importantly, be consistent and true to your words and also true to yourself. That's extremely important in organizing, in advocacy, in local communities, also the work that you're doing every day in state capitals as well. Anthony, as you talked about the bill that you all are working on in California, advocating, it takes a lot of time to have significant policy changes. Also requires that consistency, that persistence, and we know that policy takes a while, right? So what strategies have you found to be effective in working towards policy change over time, especially in the context of criminal justice reform and survivor-centered initiatives?
Yeah, it always goes back to centering the individuals closest to the problem. I think that's something that, especially this year, we're really trying to put a big emphasis on. COVID's still around, and impacts of COVID and the pandemic and being kept in the house for years, the effects of that, specifically on organizing and showing up, and the strategies that we can employ to be successful, we're definitely impacted. And the struggle has been really real to get people comfortable in showing up and even get them to a place to where they can be in the halls. And I think that's something that the last few years it's shown, and it's given legislators and staff not a false sense of like folks aren't watching, but there just hasn't been that same presence in the Capitol. And so a strategy we're really trying to deploy is having our survivors and our time done members in the Capitol at least monthly, and making sure they're seen in the halls with their shirts. They're doing literature drops, they're meeting with legislators and staff, and just reminding folks like, hey, we're here, this is what we care about, we're your constituents. Staffers really do appreciate that. It breaks the monotony of every day being a staffer, and legislators really want to talk to people that have the stories and that have been affected by these things, and they want to hear about what the needs are, they want to hear what the successes are. And so uplifting survivors and people that have been impacted, that's, I think, the greatest strategy. And then also, like, for them, the individuals themselves, the survivors, pulling back the curtain on like how things work, right? And empowering them so that they know better how they can be successful and navigate the process, and they can take that back to the community and educate folks on how to get involved, which then turns into local power, which then turns into elections and being able to hold folks accountable and or run for office. So I think just at the end of the day, making sure we have those folks at the table coming to the Capitol as frequently as possible, and reminding them that this is their house, their building, that they can exercise their power here, and they have some agency and control over the situation, is, to me, the greatest strategy that we can have.
And California has been one of the leading states thanks to Californians for Safety and Justice and Crime Survivors for Safety and Justice in the state, in passing historic criminal justice reforms and passing historic victim service reforms and expanding things like trauma recovery centers. In 2024, of course, we're going into a presidential election this year, and something we always see around important national as well as state and local elections is this rise in tough on crime rhetoric. This is happening in places like Washington, D.C., Louisiana, and also there in California as well. And I know you and the team and advocates and organizations across the country have been dealing a lot with fear mongering and also misinformation from opponents of Proposition 47. Can you talk a little bit about what's happening in the conversation around Proposition 47 and how folks can learn to navigate that kind of misinformation when they're filling out their ballots this November?
So Proposition 47 passed in 2014 here in California, and I think even before the passage of it, there was misinformation about it. So this isn't something new, unfortunately, but to your point, Aswad, it's a part of a larger narrative across the country that frankly doesn't line up with what the data and the research shows us. Something I appreciate about Californians for Safety and Justice and the Alliance, we poll, right? And we know that folks don't necessarily feel safe, which doesn't align with what the data tells us around safety and crime. And so the narrative plays a big part in driving how people do feel. And also the conflation of other issues, especially in California, right, when it comes to substance use and homelessness, which is an issue that often gets conflated with feelings of disorganization and safety. And so folks on the other side that would like to see Prop 47 repealed or undermined, they've been pushing this narrative for a long time since, like I said, before even the passage. But it's really taken more root because of the larger narratives across the country on tough on crime and trying to depict certain places as not being well run or safe for political agendas. And so we are facing a strong backlash right now, especially in the spaces of criminalization of substance uses and theft when it specifically comes to Prop 47. Try to get good information is the work we're doing and some of our partners, right? And we're constantly trying to report out what's actually happening. I do think the media in California over the last several months have really tried to take a deep dive and really dispel fact from fiction on issues around Prop 47 and crime in general. And then state legislators have become more vocal. Elected leaders like the governor and the leader of the state assembly and the leader of the Senate, they've been more vocal with their comments in regards to what the direction of the state is when it comes to issues related to Prop 47 and what can be done. So I think over the next several weeks and months, really paying attention to what some of the state leaders are saying and groups like us can direct folks to what the facts are out in the landscape on Prop 47.
If you are following what's happening in California and want to get real accurate information, you can follow Californians for Safety and Justice social media, real accurate information. So follow Californians for Safety and Justice on Instagram at Safe and Just. Anthony, I wanted to just back up a little bit about Proposition 47. Can you talk a little bit about what has been the impact of Proposition 47 for local communities and survivors? What resources are that have been saved that's being reinvested into communities in the passage of that historic reform in 2014? And why is it important to continue to sustain those resources and keep people from going into the justice system?
Yeah, I think Proposition 47 did a couple things that a lot of people don't know about, right? When most people hear Prop 47 now, they immediately think about theft. And Prop 47 did several things. And the biggest thing that I like to talk about is the savings component. The state has seen this year included roughly $800 million saved over the passage of Prop 47. So a little less than the last decade. $800 million has gone back into schools, the creations of trauma recovery centers, and resources in community to help folks that are dealing with substance abuse, mental health issues, homelessness. And just to really drive the point home, just a little over a decade ago, California only had one trauma recovery center, and now we're at 22, mostly been funded by Prop 47 savings. And so that's trauma recovery centers serving crime survivors in community, very little strings attached, just being able to really support folks on their healing journey and have just great successful results. And the same thing in the reentry, mental health, substance abuse, homelessness space, right? We've seen the evaluations of those programs have been funded over the last several years and have just gotten great results in serving folks that have struggled with those challenges. So if we start to roll back Prop 47, we'll see definite rollbacks in the savings, which then will trickle down and hurt all these communities and programs that have been funded through the savings over the last several years.
Just incredible. Over $800 million saved, being reinvested back into communities, more schools, reentry programs, substance abuse, mental health, and also the establishment of 22 trauma recovery centers in California. And those are the things that help stop the cycle of violence. Those are the things that help people heal. Those are the things that help people get back to work for stability. So if you want to get involved, once again, if you are living in California, you have family in California, please join Californians for Safety and Justice and follow the social media pages to really find out the great work that has been happening over a decade in California and the importance of sustaining those efforts to really save resources that goes back into things that actually keep us all safe. Anthony, reflecting on your experience in advocating for numerous bills signed into law, bills that you all are currently working on, what are some of the key lessons you've learned from successful advocacy efforts? And are there any common strategies you've seen that work well that other advocates and survivors who are listening today can learn from?
Everyone matters. I think this is a lesson really probably I learned just as a kid that served me well in general in life. But when I say it in this context, like everyone in a legislator's office matters. The tendency can be sometimes for folks that are not as experienced or may not know how the process works. They assign value to certain staffers in the office or certain legislators. And I like to take the approach that every single person in the office, every single person that works in the space that may be an advocate or maybe on the other side of the issue, they all matter and deserve some level of respect and attention. And so it may not completely end in a bill getting signed right then and there or that year, but people will remember that you paid attention and that you cared about details and that you paid attention to individuals who may not have played the biggest role, but they played a role. Because there's a lot of, in this work, in the advocacy space, in the legislative process, there's a lot of folks that have their fingerprints on a bill going through the process or a budget, advocacy going through the process. And so every little moment matters and is an opportunity for you to build rapport, build a relationship with those folks that have their fingerprints on the policy or on the budget. And then I think having a longer term view, the day-to-day can be very consuming and tough at times. There's some things that you just can't control. And so when there's those days that are tough and something doesn't seem like it's going right, I try to take a step back and remind myself of the things we've accomplished and look at the bigger picture and know that some of these issues have been issues for a long time, and it's okay that I may not solve the problem that day, or I may not be the person that ever solves the problem, but at the end of the day, doing my best and working to build a more positive world. I think that strategy of just recentering and reminding yourself that you're doing your best and you're controlling what you can control in this work is a strategy, at least for me, to keep myself successful and engaged and passionate about the work.
There we go, y'all. Y'all heard the blueprint from the one and only Anthony DiMartino. Anthony, it's been a pleasure talking with you. You've dropped so many lessons and knowledge and gems, right, for those who are interested in getting involved in advocacy or for those who are actively involved. As you mentioned, everyone matters. Every moment matters. When there are days that are tough that we all have, right? Every day, every week is a challenge. So just being able to just take a step back and just remind ourselves what those long-term goals are. So Anthony, thank you so much for being a guest on today's episode.
Thank you so much. And thank you to everyone that's out there listening and doing their best every day. I appreciate you all.
So thank you so much for everyone for listening to today's episode. Our membership is growing. We are over 200,000 members. If you're not a member, you can become a member. We want you to be part of our healing community. So go to cssj.org to join a local chapter near you or our national network. Remember, you can stream episodes of the Crime Survivor Speak podcast on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and other streaming platforms as well. As we always say, we are healing through action. And when survivors speak, change happens. Talk to you all on the next episode.